Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to refine this rough shape. Let's first duplicate it as a backup. The shortcut is Shift+D. Create a collection. Put the backup into it and hide this collection. From now on, we'll focus on this shape only. Before further sculpting, let's first remesh it. Keep the model selected and switch to sculpt mode at the top left corner. Find remesh at the top right corner, or we can use a shortcut to visualize it in 3D viewport. To get a proper subdivision, we can press R to visualize the voxel size. Move the mouse horizontally to adjust the mesh density. Keep in mind, don't set the mesh density too high at this stage, as a lower mesh density is more conducive to controlling the shape. Let's try 0.02 and check the result. I think this density is fine. Let's remesh it. This way, all the meshes will be merged into one. The mesh is somewhat sparse. Well, maybe denser is better. 0.01 should be alright. Let's give it a go. Now we remesh it again with the new value. Good. Let's keep it at 0.01 for now. Alright, now we're gonna dive into sculpting. First, let's fix these sharp edges using Smooth tool. Well, I need to turn on screencast keys so you can see my shortcuts. If you find this window too small, you can press Shift plus spacebar to show this list. In this way, you can directly switch to any brush you want anytime without touching the sidebar, and hide the brush list on the left. Meanwhile, you can hold Ctrl plus spacebar to maximize the 3D view. A larger view enables us to see more of the model, thus helping us better concentrate on sculpting. Display in panel, switch to Tool tab. Let's first quickly fix these sharp edges. Hold Shift and draw. The brush will be switched to smooth automatically as shown here. If you feel the display of face sets is distracting, you can just hide it by unchecking face sets here. Okay, let's continue to fix this big shape. This part could go quickly. There are various brushes for us to choose for different parts. We can fix these issues quickly by switching to proper brush flexibly. Use Inflate brush to thicken the tail. Now, let's go back to the main references. We'll adjust the contour of the back based on this one. I find the lower reference has a more nice-looking contour of the back. Let's adjust the back according to this one. Switch to Clay Strips brush to fix this odd structure. Which is caused by the basic geometries we used when building it. It's easy to form sharp edges at the junction of the geometries, but that's fine. We can fix it easily. Let's take a look at this picture, and we can find a few turning points. We can see an obvious turning point above the hip bone, and another near the root of the tail, then the front shoulder, and then the neck. Okay, let's bring them out. this turning point, and here. Then the front shoulder. That's it. Let's move on to this thing here that connects the belly and the legs. Switch to Mask Brush and work on this part with the help of Mask. Locate its position and draw a mask. Then press Ctrl+I to invert the mask. Drag out this structure. It quickly takes shape, but it appears stretched. So let's remesh it with Ctrl+R. Turn to the bottom view. Let's use Draw Sharp Brush to adjust this structure. Now, let's make it embed a bit on the inner side. Okay, let's check the contour of the back again. We can make the turning point above the hip bone even clearer. Let's switch to another reference for a clearer view of the structure. We'll then adjust the upper part of the leg. Now let's observe the reference carefully and determine a direction. We can see a slope here, which means that the top of the hind legs is not at the same level as the spine. Let's switch to the Multi-Plane Scrape tool. By default, it scrapes the mesh with two angled planes with an inward sharp edge between them. It can flatten the mesh if we hold Ctrl to invert it. We can create a single plane quickly. I think the top of hind legs here needs a bit more adjustment. It should be straight without much curvature. How do we determine the slope of the spine here? Let me demonstrate it for you. We use this point as the center and draw a cross-coordinate system. Then connect the center point to this point. Now we can see the angle intuitively. In fact, we can roughly estimate it visually. This is a basic way of observing objects. I will try to explain some similar methods in the later procedures. Actually, we can't rely solely on this slope because the legs are moving, which can affect the contour of the back. Let's keep this effect for now, and we can refine it based on other references later. Alright, let's take a look at the front legs. Find out the references of the front view. We can see that the front legs are a bit thin. So let's fix this issue. In the stage of framework, I use Grab Brush a lot, which can help me quickly create a shape with contour and volume, although it's not quite precise. Now we are going to adjust the contour of the front legs according to the reference. Let's switch to Draw Brush and see if we can make the couture more quickly. This brush is suitable for creating a concrete structure shape, but if I want a more precise contour, I find Grab Brush is better. You can choose either accordingly. Here I will go with Grab Brush. By the way, let me refine the belly a bit. There was something wrong with my drawing tablet, pressure sensitivity issue. Well, it works fine now. Okay, let's keep working on smoothing out this rough shape and fixing incorrect parts. After the big shape in the previous step is completed, and we are about to refine it, the first step is to correct the shape created during the big shape stage. Just like what we did, correcting the contours of various parts, processing hard corners, etc. The ultimate goal of these efforts is to make every part more accurate. Now, with a little tweaking, most of the obvious issues have actually been fixed. Next, let's adjust each part according to the references of different views. Based on it, let's fine-tune the hind legs a bit more. In the big shape stage, we have to focus on two aspects, the contour and the volume. The contour is the shape of the outline in each view. The main basis for making the contour is the turning points we found when analyzing the reference before. These points will help us find the accurate contour quickly. The volume is to find accurate sections in 3 dimensions, so as to build the general shape of the structure more accurately. At this step, the volume we shape is actually more like a delicate gift packaging box. We are just preparing a perfect box for the structure we will make later. In fact, when we first built the big shape, we were already shaping the volume. At this step, we will start to modify the contour from each view to make the volume more accurate. So it can be said that the volume and contour are modified at the same time. Remember, we're not aiming for the final level of details just yet, so don't worry too much about the finer details. Just focus on getting the big shape right. Also, because the mesh density is low, we won't be able to capture very subtle details anyway. By the way, when sculpting, it's better to observe the shape from multiple angles rather than just one. Seems the strength of smooth is too high. Let's reduce it a bit to avoid smoothing away the structure. It's 0.7 now. We decrease it to around 0.4. Good. Switch to inflate brush. As we mentioned early, when we work on a thin area with draw brush, the opposite side may be edited by accident. Let me show you. See, a slightly larger brush will cause this. That's the reason I recommend inflate brush in this situation. Then we can use grab brush to further modify the contour. For now, let's keep the hind legs as is and move on to the other parts. Find the previous reference for this structure. It's this one. Let's modify the body shape according to it. First, take a look at this reference picture. By observing the shadow relationship on the wolf, we can find that there is a face here on the back. Here we draw this face. The edge of this surface is positioned quite low, approximately here. Here, the contour is quite distinct. Let's bring it out. First, we use clay strips brush to draw the contour, and then switch to grab brush to further modify its shape. Adjust the belly a bit more. Currently, the mesh density is a bit low, so we are not able to add subtle details. Once we finalize the overall effect, we'll raise the density of the mesh for more details. So for now, we keep its structure here. If we want to make the shape more accurate, thus increasing the density, then the density of other parts will be too high. So if the current mesh density is no longer enough for us to continue refining the shape here, then we will stop for a while and move on to making other parts. Alright, we check its structure from the top view and find a corresponding reference. We switch to a perspective almost identical to the reference. When adjusting the contour from the top view, we need to adjust it in conjunction with the side view, because what we are currently making is a shape with a complex structure. Therefore, the edges of the silhouette are presented by different parts. When we make the top view contour, we must also find the exact position of each point of the entire contour in the structure. Only in this way can we make the top view contour correct and accurate. Look at the chest area. We can see the prominent part is approximately here, and it should be brought out correctly. We need to make this part protrude, while the other parts need to be drawn inward. Now, let's tweak the structure of the front shoulder area. Next, we'll introduce a few essential bone points. The top part of the front shoulder right here is a prominent point, just like the roll of brow ridge, and can be taken as a coordinate system. This part is also an important transition that links the scapula to the humerus. We can draw this bone point above the scapula by pulling it out. Let's sculpt the structure here, and then fine-tune it with clay strips tool. We need to refer to the reference image. Find the reference of body. Take a look at our main reference. We can see the clear contour of the upper leg in this image. Let's modify the shape of the upper leg with this image. Because the faces here are close, we'll use the inflate brush to handle it. Now, let's focus on this front shoulder part. Take a close look at this reference, especially the scapula and upper leg. We can mark it with lines and try analyzing it. We can continue working on it while analyzing new content that we didn't cover before. Let's draw the rough shape of the shoulder, and the shape of the scapula is like this. We can draw the shape of the joint, as well as the upper leg area. Due to the long and thick fur, the structure isn't very obvious, and their extensions might be larger. Nevertheless, the structure here is noticeable. Let's emphasize it. We can change the focal length when modeling. Raise it to 120 millimeters. This is convenient to view the model as 3D viewport without causing obvious deformation. Here is the joint. Let's emphasize it. And the ankle here. Good. Let's further sculpt the structure of the paws. The front part represents the toes. It should not be cubic, so we hold Shift and smooth it out. Now move to bottom view. Let's adjust the shape of the paws. Okay, it looks all right from afar. Move on to the tail. Select Inflate tool. Actually, the mesh density here is a bit low, so we can't do much here. We'll refine it in the next level. Next, let's take a look at the head and neck. The neck is covered by longer fur, so it's challenging to view its structure based on references only. I found out the image of a dog earlier. We can refer to it to examine the structure of the neck. Also, an anatomical diagram of wolves or canines can provide us with some guidance. In the process of making models, you can find more references of this type. Since it has no hair, we can directly see the shape inside and make the model directly according to it. Or you can search for many pictures of artistic anatomy on the internet. These information can help us observe and create structures. When we are making the structure, we can see these protruding muscle shapes, but it is not necessary to use a brush to draw this protrusion on the model. We should not only observe the bulges, but also the concave parts in the middle. Because after we created the concave areas with some brushes like this, the protrusions will naturally follow. So when observing protrusions, it's equally important to observe concave areas. Next, we'll work on the head. Based on our earlier analysis, we've outlined the rough structure, so let's proceed with that reference. Let's start by examining the perspective view. First, let's create a big shape. When working on the big shape, it's not necessary to be too meticulous. Instead, we shall prioritize broad strokes to establish a well-structured foundation. Concentrating on every single detail is actually not what we want. Don't worry too much about details in this stage. Just follow the analysis and get it done by any means necessary. We work on this front part here. Let's modify the snout shape. Now the shape of the head is made according to our analysis. Now let us make the crease where the eyes and mouth connect. Good, just keep it for now. Let's create the ears now. They should be here. We will use Mask tool. Press M to switch to Mask brush. Draw the rough area of the ears. And erase the excessive part. When it's done, press Ctrl+I to invert the mask, then drag out the ears. Cool. Now, let's check the side view. Find out an image in a better angle. The main reference doesn't show the ears from a proper angle. Let's find another. This one looks alright. Let's modify the ear's direction according to the reference. Clear the mask by pressing Alt+M. We don't want the head to be facing straight ahead, so rotate it slightly. Enter Edit mode. Go back to the general layout and set Transform Pivot Point to 3D Cursor. By default, the pivot is in the center of the selection. But my desired pivot is this point. We place 3D Cursor at this point. Then set Transform Pivot Point to 3D Cursor and select the mesh of the head to rotate. Don't forget to enable proportional editing and connect it only. Adjust the radius of proportional editing by rolling the mouse wheel. Well, maybe it's better to place the pivot at this point. Unselect a part of vertices here, since there's more deformation. Alright, it's getting there. Let's tweak its shape a bit. Take a look at the reference from front view. Let's find the position of the ears and adjust the distance between them according to the reference. Since the ear part is a low-density mesh that we dragged out, we need to remesh our model to handle it. But if we directly remesh it like before, the whole model will be remeshed, then the structure we made before will be affected. Like the hind legs have changes obviously. To avoid this issue mostly, we can properly raise the mesh density after remeshing, just modify voxel size of remesh. We can hold R to choose a smaller voxel size than the previous one and press Ctrl+R to remesh the model. Nice. Next, let's smooth out the sharp edges on the surface. Okay, switch to Draw Brush and start sculpting the shape of the ears. As shown before, we will make the basic structure of the ears first, and then gradually refine the details later. Currently, it's all out of shape. We use Drag Brush to fix it. Grab Brush is good at building basic shapes. We can complete it quickly. We're missing the eyes. Let's drag out its structure first, and we'll refine it later. Before refining it, let's double-check if the ears are in the right position from the side view. We also need to check the model in different angles. In this image, we find the ears are closer to the backup, at the very back and of the head. We need to move the ears accordingly. We can also use the eyes as a basis to observe the distance between the eyes and ears, so as to determine the position of the ears. Okay, let's continue to fix this part. Now, we're going to focus on the ears. Refine its structure outside and inside. Let's look at the model farther away so that we can see the overall shape and observe whether the proportions of each structure are coordinated. Let's adjust the shape of the current model from this perspective. During sculpting, it's essential to observe the model from multiple angles. There's also a small structure near the lower part of the ear, known as Henry's pocket. You can search for it, as many animals have this thing. Now, let's check it from behind. Not sure if there's any proper reference. Let's find it out. This one is fine. We can see the structure of the back of the ears. From the reference, we can observe that although the ears are also covered with thick hair, obvious edges can still be seen. Let's draw the edges of the model's ears. Let's leave it at this point. No need to refine it further. Smooth out the mesh again. When we zoomed out to observe the overall effect of the model, I found that there were still issues with the contours of the head and neck, so let's make overall adjustments. When adjusting the contour, we still use grab brush. Okay, let's go ahead and smooth out the body part, then adjust the overall effect of the body in this farther perspective. After this refinement, the basic structure is now established. In the next stage, we'll refine each structure further, making them more precise and complete. Now, let's go back to the main reference again, and double-check if the proportion is proper, and if there are any issues with the overall shape. The length of the head seems a bit short. Then its width. The width is 1.5. Alright, let's keep this effect for now. Here we try to refine the shape of the head slightly, and we try to smooth out the sharp edges and corners of the head. If we continue refining, we'll get caught up in the details. Next, let's review other areas and see if anyone needs refinements. Some areas had a lower mesh density earlier, so we didn't continue working on them. Now, let's proceed with refining. Before that, let's first check the overall proportions and see if there are any issues. Compared with this reference, the back contour here still needs some further adjustments. This leg looks a little short, gonna lengthen it a bit. And clearly, this section is too long. This section should be shorter than this one. Good. Let's check the effect now. Okay, the length is close to the reference. We still gotta nail down more details on this spot. Draw Sharp tool works perfectly to bring out this detail. It's convenient to draw the edges of the structure with Draw Sharp brush. Alright, in the next stage, we'll fine-tune each part to get the final look of the high poly. That's all for this lesson. See you in the next one. In this section, we will continue to refine the structure of the model. About the body and the head part, we choose to refine them separately. It's because the function remesh has its drawbacks. It will make the polygons distributed evenly according to the set values. But when we are sculpting the head, it requires a higher density of mesh for sufficient details, while the body does not require as many. So if we continue using remesh to distribute the polygons automatically, it will raise the density of the body part at the same time, which is bad because the overall mesh density of the model will be raised much higher accordingly. And our further sculpting process will be lagging and stuck. That's why we will separate the head and sculpt it separately after the body sculpting is completed. Now let's refine the model step by step, starting with the body. We will continue using the previous references, although some may become less relevant over time. Now that our model has gone through the 2 steps of building the big shape and refining the big shape structure, there is basically no problem with the proportions. Next, we will pay attention to the specific shapes of each. First, we need to emphasize the characteristics of the wolf. As we have mentioned before, wolves and dogs both belong to the canine family, and their anatomy is very similar. If we do not pay enough attention, it is very likely that the effect of our final completed model will appear to be that of a dog instead of a wolf. In the initial stage of this section, we need to further correct the direction of the model production to make it possess the characteristics of a wolf. Wolves have larger heads and longer snouts compared to dogs, and wolves have 5 toes on their front limbs, while we only sculpted 4. The 5th toe, known as the dew claw, is located on the inner side of the front limbs. It is not prominent since it's very small. This dew claw is a key feature distinguishing wolves from dogs, so we need to pay a special attention here during sculpting. About the front shoulder, the wolf's is narrower than the dog's. From these references, we can see clearly that the spacing between a wolf's front limbs is smaller. Knowing about these main features, we must differentiate between the wolf and the dog during sculpting, or we might end up modeling a dog instead of a wolf by mistake, as both are canines. So, this point is crucial. Now let's get started. First, tweak the proportions of the head, tweak the width and length of the model, making it wider and longer. Next are the front legs. The distance between the wolf's front legs is narrower than that of the dog. We should also pay attention to this. These are the references of front view we found earlier. We noticed the narrow spacing between the legs, so we need to adjust the space between the legs based on the reference. We'll use lasso mask on the front legs. Find box mask from the sidebar and hold the left mouse button to list different types of brushes. Here we select lasso mask. Switch to side view and grab box mask, then press Ctrl+I to invert the mask. Under the mask menu, we find smooth mask to smooth the edges of the mask. See, they're getting blurry. Press Shift+R to repeat the last step for a few times. Then we can see the mask edges become very blurred and are transiting naturally. Next, we use Move tool to move it toward the center to adjust the width to a proper value. We might notice a gap in the legs here, showing the hard transition of the mask edges. It's okay. Let's press Ctrl+Z to undo, and try using the smooth mask again to see if it can be fixed. It's still there. In normal cases, there won't be such sharp edges. It's likely a software computation issue. Anyway, let's not dwell on this. We will use Smooth Brush to rectify any issues after adjustment. Press Alt+M to clear the mask, then use Smooth Brush to fix the issue caused by the previous operation. We can select any brush and hold Shift to enable Smooth Brush. Then we smooth out the uneven parts. See, it's fixed right away. Okay, because the front legs have been moved toward the middle, the front shoulders are a little wider. Let's use Grab Brush to tweak the shape of the front shoulders to fit the adjusted leg width. Okay, now we're going to create the dew claw. In order to make its position more accurate, we first check the pose of the legs and feet before creating it. To create the dew claw, we use a cube to model this structure, similar to our approach during the rough shape stages, adjusting its shape quickly with a cube. Dew claws also grow on some dogs' front limbs, but have mostly regressed in most breeds, remaining only in larger dogs like the German Shepherd. This structure should have been modeled during the early stages, but was overlooked. After modeling the dew claw, we merge it with the body model, then use Remesh to fully integrate both parts, and then use Symmetry in Sculpt mode to symmetrize the effect onto the other side. It goes well. After smoothing out the uneven parts, we need to further tweak the shape here. Additionally, there should be a small heel on the back side of the leg. Well, so far we've completed the necessary corrections to the model. Now, let's start refining our model step by step. First, we will refine the hind legs. We'll use this perspective reference we previously found, which helps us observe the contour and structure of the hind legs. In the reference, we can observe the shape here on the leg, and we make it based on the reference. During the sculpting process, we can use clay brush to build up the volume of the structure. Instead of directly sculpting each muscle, we first identify several key points of the structure. For example, there's a noticeable indentation on the back of the hind leg and a prominent bone point at the front near the pelvis. We prioritize sculpting around these key structural points. These points can be thought of as a coordinate system, helping us accurately locate the shape and position of each structure. We can refine the leg structure using this reference, where the contour and structure can be clearly seen. When creating animal models, we need to consider the entire workflow, including model, textures, hair, and rigging. When creating the shape, we need to consider how the mesh affects the hair. If the structure is accurate, it's not necessary to sculpt muscle shapes too prominently. In reality, the bodies of animals are typically covered with thick fur, and not all muscles are clearly visible. Thus, we need to decide which structures require detailed sculpting and which do not. For structures that are clearly visible, we need to sculpt in detail. For others that will be covered by fur, a rough sketch is sufficient, as details won't be visible in the final effect. When I was creating the wolf model, I had already reviewed a lot of anatomical data on wolves, so I had a clear understanding of wolf structure. Therefore, during the sculpting process, I combine reference images with anatomical data, which might seem like I'm not strictly following the reference images. This is because some parts might not be clear or even visible in the reference images, not because I have any special ability, but because I've been deeply impressed by the anatomical structures through extensive research. Thus, I suggest comparing anatomical diagrams with reference images during sculpting. This approach will lead to a more accurate understanding of structures and result in more realistic models. In the heel part, we should be aware that the most prominent thing on this joint is the bone structure, because the surface here is basically only thin muscles, skin, and hair. The bones are very obvious here, and the material of bone is different from that of muscles. It will have sharper turns and structural bulges with larger drops. We can also clearly see this in the reference picture. The same goes for the downward part of the metacarpus and toes, which shows a stronger sense of bone. It needs to be represented when sculpting the uneven surface of the model. Next, we will gradually draw the shape of the toes. Just make a rough outline of the toes first. Now we are not in a hurry to draw the details. Continue to sculpt the shape of the toes. From this reference, we can see both the inner and outer sides of the legs. This reference is quite useful, which I didn't see during the analysis phase. Let's use this reference to make the structure of the inner side of the leg. Next, let's adjust the shape of the hind toes. Note that wolves have 4 toes on their hind feet, but these toes are on different levels, with the middle 2 toes positioned higher and forward, and the outer 2 lower and further backward. Knowing this, we can quickly model the rough shape of the foot. Regarding the knee joint, it's similar to humans, not just a single joint separating the thigh and shin, but 2 bones intersecting, creating a small indentation in the middle. The same applies to the wolf's hind leg. It's not one turning point that separates the thigh and shin. We need to notice that. In this step, I will carefully observe the reference image and sculpt the muscles and structures using my anatomical knowledge. You might have noticed that I usually follow these steps when sculpting. 1. Identify the most protruding, obvious bony point of the part and sculpt it out. 2. Centering on this bony point, gradually identify other important structural points. 3. Finally, sculpt the direction of the muscles and other fine structures. This sequence ensures the accuracy of the structure's position and proportions. Sculpting from the whole to the parts avoids wasting time on details and improves sculpting efficiency. Specifically, before refining a part, I will observe the whole to identify the most important structure, usually the most protruding, obvious bony point. After identifying this point, I sculpt it out and use it as the center of the coordinate system for that part. Next, centering on this bony point, I will gradually identify other important structural points. Usually these points are the connection point of the muscle or skeletal turning points. Once I find them, I will roughly sculpt them out. Finally, I'll sculpt the muscle direction and other subtle structures. I still feel there are issues with the leg's contour, so we'll continue to find and compare other references and make further adjustments. Use Draw Sharp brush to separate the toes at the bottom of the foot. Then, we need to adjust the contour of the paw. The rough shape of the foot is already done. We now only need to separate the shapes of the 4 toes. There are some issues about the rough shape of the foot, but we'll adjust it gradually. So as the structure of the calf, we'll look for a suitable reference that allows us to observe clearly. Let's search among the existing references to see if we can find a more suitable reference picture. Finding a suitable reference picture will be of great help to our production. This reference provides a clear contour of the hind leg, which we'll use to adjust the model structure. For the calf part, we'll adjust it to this state for now. Return to this reference. We'll use it to adjust the structure of the paw. In the metacarpal bone, we need to deliberately sculpt the contour of the bone, because we can clearly see the underlying structures from the reference, and they are hairy. If the model cannot present these structures, then after the hair is added, the structure here will be further weakened. So here, we need to make the gaps and contours of these structures more obvious and clear. For the metacarpus part, we sculpt the obvious shapes of the 4 bones of the metacarpal bone. Just like our human hands and feet, the bones in this part are obvious. Next, we further sculpt out the gaps between each toe. There is a structure in front of each toe that grows a nail. When sculpting the paw structure, we only need to identify the highest point of each toe, based on which we can sculpt the other structures. The middle part can be modeled by analyzing the skeletal structure of the paw. The bone between the paw and this joint is shaped like this. This is a bone grows from here to this point, the metatarsal, then from the bottom of the foot to the highest point, and then to here and here. Below is the pad of the foot. And we need to leave some space in front of each toe for the nails to grow. Alright, Since the current mesh is still not dense enough, we'll sculpt to this effect for now, and we'll come back to sculpt the other details after remesh. That's it for the hind legs for now. There are still some issues. Next, we will continue refining and sculpting the body part. Let's find the structural references for the body. And examine it from various angles. As we see from the front view, the ears appear small. Let's use grab brush to tweak their shape. From the top view, we'll sculpt the approximate shape of the spine. Note it when sculpting the thoracic part, if we want to accurately depict the structure of the rib cage, we need to identify the precise bone points, and we also need to distinguish between the hard areas and the soft areas in the thoracic part. Like the areas supported by ribs are hard, and the areas of the abdomen are mostly covered with muscles, they are soft. For example, the rear part of the rib cage has obvious edges. The bones are obvious here because it's supported by the ribs below. The front part connected to the front legs is smoother because it is covered by a lot of muscles. We can use our common knowledge of human anatomy to judge that, as the structures of humans and animals are similar. Therefore, when we are sculpting the underlying structure, we should follow this logic. Make the posterior parts more defined. If we were to sculpt the shape of the ribs on the front part as well, it would be incorrect, because normally, even though ribs are present, they are not obvious due to the covering muscles. At this point, we can switch to the trackball mode mentioned earlier. Under the default settings, when we want to sculpt the abdomen, we just rotate the view to observe the abdomen. Due to the limitations of the view rotation method, we cannot directly adjust to a suitable angle to observe the sculpting. It will be more troublesome to rotate to the appropriate angle, then we can switch to trackball mode. By the way, remember to click Save Preferences after setting up, so that the current settings will be preserved when you launch Blender later, which helps us quickly change to the appropriate angle according to our sculpting habits, allowing us to observe the model from different perspectives. Now we can start sculpting in a big way. Next, we can gradually refine the model based on what we observe in our references. The contour here behind the ribs is more obvious. The abdominal part is covered with abdominal muscles. And the bones are not obvious. Sculpting the body structure is relatively quick. we have basically finished sculpting the body part. It's been a long time, so I'll stop here for now in this lesson, and we'll continue making it in the next lesson. We finished sculpting the body part in the last lesson, and we will continue to sculpt other parts in this lesson. Next, we will sculpt the detail of the front legs, starting by identifying several key bone points. The first is the scapula, where we can find the highest point. In this structural reference, we can observe the body structure vaguely visible under the fur, and here is the upper arm. A bit upward, this structure is the form of the scapula, and based on the reference, we distinguish between the scapula and the upper arm. In this reference, we can still vaguely see the contour of the muscles. You may also be able to observe that this can be used as a basis for sculpting the muscle structure of the front shoulder area. We need to find a reference that clearly shows the structure of the upper arm. This reference is all right. We adjust the effect of the model according to this one. To refine the forearm, we first sketch the main bone points, then continue with the muscle structure. The inner side of the legs is the part that connects with the body. Now we will modify the connection structure. Because we currently do not have detailed structures for the chest and legs of the model, now we can only make a rough shape. The linking parts of these structures will be gradually sculpted when we gradually refine each structure. We continue to observe and modify the structure of the lower leg from different perspectives. Here we can see a structure that goes from the outer side of the leg to the inner side. This structure is an important part of the leg. Let's adjust the shape here. Okay, let's go back to the shoulders. Now, let's roughly deal with the structure where the neck connects to the forelimbs. In anatomy, there is a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which connects directly from the part below the ear to the front of the chest. So this muscle structure is one of the main structures we deal with when connecting the body to the neck. That's it for the neck for now. So far, our main target is still the shoulders. Modify the structure of the upper arm according to the reference. The muscle structure in the upper arm seems to have quite a problem, so we find the reference image and modify the structure here. First, if we see the upper arm from the side, the main muscle is the triceps. We need to observe whether the area and shape of the muscle are correct. Observe and adjust the shape of the front shoulder from multiple views. We follow this reference and observe the contour of the part above the leg, through which we can also see the shape of the upper arm is roughly a trapezoid, wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, connecting to the shoulder part at the top and the calf at the bottom. Okay, since the reference just now shows really limited structures, I just searched for other references that are more suitable for observation and production. Here I found 3 more pictures. In the first picture, we can observe the shape of the upper leg from the front view. In the picture below, we can clearly see the contour of the upper leg. Here we continue to modify the structure of the upper leg based on the side view just now. At this point, let me pause and analyze the structure here for everyone. First of all, we still look at the structure of the upper leg. In the upper leg, we actually only need to pay attention to the shape of one muscle, which is called the triceps brachii. It is composed of 2 parts, the long head and the lateral head. We mark their shapes in the view. After understanding the composition here, it will be more directional to continue the production. Next, we will mainly sculpt the structure here. When sculpting muscle shapes, you need to pay attention to one thing. There is a superposition relationship between muscles. Except for the clearest contour on the edge, in fact, the inner contour is formed with another muscle superimposed on the surface. The structural contour of the triceps brachii we see on the surface is actually incomplete, and part of it is covered underneath by other muscles. We definitely don't need to make the covered area below, but when sculpting the contours formed by covering, we need to consider the superposition relationship. The ravines here usually should not be sculpted directly with draw brush. Instead, it should be a structural transition formed by sculpting the structure of other parts. Here is the structure of the scapula. I just adjusted the contour of the shoulders based on this picture. At this angle, I can clearly see the shape of the contour. Continue to adjust the outline of the upper leg part. Through it, we can also see the shape of the upper leg, roughly a trapezoid, wider at the top and narrower at the bottom, and the upper part connects to the shoulders, and the lower part connects to the calves. Find this front view reference of the leg and modify the structure of the calf based on it. Use Draw Sharp brush to sculpt the silhouette of the structure here. There are multiple muscle overlaps in the inner side area of the legs, like the biceps brachii and pectoral muscles intersect here, so we need to pay attention to the structure here. When sculpting this part, we must first locate the starting and ending points of the biceps brachii and pectoral muscles. Then, following the direction of the muscles, we roughly sculpt them out. Now we start to sculpt the structure of the inner side of the calf. We need to find a reference picture that can clearly show the inner side. We need to make it based on the reference, which will be more accurate, and avoid making the model without a reference. This is a good reference. We can clearly see the structure of the inner side of the calf. This structure is wrapped from the outer side to the inner side. Now we are sculpting the pectoralis major muscle among the chest muscles. The tail end of the pectoralis major muscle is connected to the inner side of the leg. The other part of the pectoral muscle, the pectoralis minor, is under the pectoralis major. The pectoralis minor is also connected to the legs on the inner side of the legs. The structure on the inner side of the front legs is actually more complicated, and we need to spend more time on sculpting. There are multiple muscle groups intertwining and intersecting on the front legs. We need to clarify the structure. Move downward. Here is the structure of the ankle. We need to make the joints of the ankle at this position. Let's pause here and take a look at this reference picture. Here I mark what I observed. Let's analyze this structure, and in this image, we can see a group of muscles that attaches to the surface of the leg by wrapping around it. This structure is also present in human arms, controlling the rotation of the forearm. We can observe that in humans, the arm is divided into three parts: the upper arm, forearm, and hand, but only the forearm can rotate laterally, thanks to a group of muscles that allow for more flexible movement. The wolf's forearm has a similar muscular structure to humans, allowing flexible motion. After sculpting, the structure of the lower leg now looks much more reasonable. Next, we continue to modify other parts of the front legs, because there are still a lot of unfinished parts of the front legs. Just now, we were only focusing on sculpting each structure, and we ignored the overall effect. Now switch to the panoramic view and observe the model as a whole. There's something wrong with the contour here, so let's fix it. The structure of the neck part is a bit rough. The structure of the neck is relatively simple. Now let's sculpt it in detail. The muscle at the bottom of the structure we are sculpting now is called the sternomastoid muscle. It is located at the bottom of the neck and is also an integral part of the neck. There is a depression here. This depression is caused by the junction of three muscles, and there is no muscle support at the bottom. Let's take a look at the model from afar. The neck has been replenished and looks much better now. We'll look through the references for a more suitable one to sculpt the forearm. We notice the body structure is somewhat flat and needs to be strengthened. Regardless of whether we used the grab brush or the draw brush just now, the sculpted structure was relatively smooth. Next, we need to emphasize the contour of the muscles. We switch to draw sharp brush and draw the contour. The effect drawn using this brush is much more intuitive. Okay, that's almost it. Let's continue to observe and modify other parts. The structure here needs to be more obvious, so we sculpt out the depressions of the muscles. Still, find the structural reference. We adjust the structure of the calf side according to the reference. Here, we focus on the ankle, which needs to emphasize the bone points of the joint. Now, let's move downward and start sculpting the feet, now the metacarpus part. We need to separate the 5 toes of the front legs first. The dew claws grow on the side, so actually we only need to separate 4 toes when sculpting. The position of the dew claw is incorrect. We'll smooth it out and sculpt it again later. When we sculpt the toes here, we use the same method as the hind feet. We still need to modify the rough shape first. The 2 toes in the middle are more protruding than the toes on both sides. Due to the low density, we cannot sculpt the details of the feet yet. We'll need to subdivide and continue sculpting later. Alright, let's conduct an overall check of the model to address any issues observed from a general perspective. Alright, let's move on to detailing the feet. Previously, when sculpting the hind feet, we discussed the approach to sculpting feet. Let's recap that. Once we've sculpted the big shape, we need to identify the key bone points and the deepest points of the toes. The key bone points are the joints that protrude the most. Now, let's sculpt the shape of the foot pad from the sole. We're mainly sculpting the recessed structures here. As you watch, you'll notice that I typically follow the same method, sculpting both depressions and protrusions simultaneously. For example, while sculpting the sole structure, we sculpt out the recessed parts first to define their boundaries, then add some protrusions where necessary to complete the sculpting process. This sequential sculpting method feels effective to me, especially when working on the big shape. Once the big shape sculpting is done, detailing becomes much easier because the foundational shape is correct. When sculpting the body earlier, we changed the orbit method to trackball for better observation. However, when sculpting the feet, this method seems a bit unwieldy because the feet need to be firmly planted on the ground. If the angle is tilted, it's difficult to observe the model. Adjust your operation method according to the situation. Insufficient mesh density hinders more detailed sculpting. Therefore, we must increase the mesh density before proceeding. But before doing so, let's tweak the overall contour shape. When we switch to the bottom view, you'll notice a rough effect, particularly on the feet and the gaps between the toes. This is due to the low mesh density, preventing us from completing these areas. We'll refine these areas further after increasing the mesh density. Now, let's take a look at the overall effect. Currently, due to the limitation of the model's mesh density, we can only sculpt the body to this level of detail. Next, we need to increase the mesh density to further refine the body structure. The tail's thickness transition is uneven, so let's adjust the tail's contour. After returning to the panoramic view, we'll observe the model as a whole. We notice that the structure in the chest area and neck is a bit rough. Before further increasing the mesh density, we need to refine these parts. It's important to note that typically, lower mesh density provides greater control over the model, while higher mesh density reduces this control. With lower mesh density, we can observe and adjust the model easily. However, we're limited in sculpting details at this stage. Our focus is on shaping each structure and the overall model effect, not on details. When we increase the mesh density, our focus shifts to detailing. We seldom modify the overall structure or the model's overall effect at this stage, and the future modification is more likely against a specific area. Each refinement is done while maintaining the current mesh density, and we try not to increase the mesh density. Since it becomes inconvenient to adjust the rough shape after increasing mesh density, we should refer to references from various views for one more comprehensive check and adjustment before subdividing. Check the front view reference to modify the structure of the forelimbs. When examining the references, we should ignore the length of the fur. Such as the inner side of the limbs, the reference is covered by fur, is slightly different from our sculpted model. At the joints, the inner side is actually more protruding than the outer side. It's here, the inner side of the joints. Let's check the tail's length. After observing the reference and comparing it to the thigh part, which starts from the highest point down to the Achilles tendon, we find the tail a bit longer, so we need to shorten the current tail as it is a bit too long now. After adjusting the tail, let's observe the structure and form of the legs from various angles. The body is done for now. Lastly, let's adjust the neck part. Alright, that concludes this lesson. In the next one, we'll further increase the mesh density to sculpt more details.